At the most extravagant wedding Willow Heights had ever seen, the champagne flowed, the string quartet played, and every detail shimmered with wealth and tradition. But beneath the surface of elegance, something far less refined was unfolding. One guest, dressed with quiet grace, carrying herself with dignity, was dismissed, sidelined, and subtly disrespected by those who thought they knew what class looked like. Her name was Evelyn Turner. To them she was just the groom's black grandmother, a polite presence they could ignore. They didn't know her story. They didn't know her name was carved into buildings, written into legacies, whispered in reverence by people far outside their polished little world. But they were about to find out, because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you try to keep in the shadows. And by the end of the night, the Montgomerys, the proud, pristine family behind this fairy tale wedding, would be left speechless as the truth shattered every assumption they held dear. This isn't just a story about status and snobbery. It's about revelation. It's about redemption. And it's about the moment a woman who needed no spotlight finally stepped into it. Willow Heights didn't welcome outsiders. It tolerated them so long as they knew their place. Here, wealth wasn't new. It was generational. Families didn't just own property, they owned history. Country clubs passed down like family heirlooms. Schools taught etiquette before arithmetic. And at the top of this social pyramid sat the Montgomerys. To call them wealthy would be an understatement. Richard and Victoria Montgomery didn't just have money. They wore it like armor. Their estate wasn't just a home, it was a symbol. Marble columns, walls lined with oil portraits of ancestors who had made their fortune long before most people even had the chance. They were preparing for what Victoria called the wedding of the decade, not just their daughter Olivia's big day, but a spectacle to reinforce their legacy. Guest lists were vetted with surgical scrutiny. The menu had its own planning committee, and photographers, handpicked to capture only what Victoria wanted the world to see. Olivia, their only child, had grown up in that world of appearances, groomed for perfection, schooled in manners, charity galas, and the art of saying a lot without revealing anything real. But despite it all, she had fallen unexpectedly and uncontrollably in love. Michael Turner was everything Olivia wasn't raised to value. Self-made, grounded, black, and he was proud of it. An architect with vision and discipline, Michael didn't care for high society. He cared about legacy in a different way, about impact, about integrity, and he owed much of who he was to the woman who raised him. His mother, Evelyn Turner. She would attend the wedding. That much Olivia had agreed to, but she never imagined her family would treat Evelyn the way they did, and she certainly didn't imagine what Evelyn would do in return. The day of the wedding arrived like a coronation. Guests in designer suits filtered through iron gates, their names checked by clipboard-bearing assistants. Waiters glided past with champagne, every detail polished within an inch of its life. Victoria stood near the grand staircase, greeting her chosen few with the kind of grace that only functions when control is absolute. And then Evelyn Turner arrived. She stepped from the car without a word, wearing a dark, elegant suit, not flashy, not loud, just quietly refined. Her posture? Impeccable. Her expression? Unshaken. But the silence around her said everything. Whispers began almost immediately. "Is that the groom's mother? I thought someone said she was important. She doesn't look like someone important." Victoria spotted her and moved in. A smile, tight, professional, shallow. "You must be Michael's mother." No mention of her name. No warmth in her tone. No effort to disguise the dismissal. Evelyn offered a slight smile. "Yes, I'm Evelyn." Victoria nodded, but had already turned to greet another guest. The damage was done in small, deliberate gestures. A name unspoken, a seat reassigned, a glance avoided. They didn't need to say much. Their silence shouted for them, and Evelyn heard every word of it. She had been here before, rooms like this, faces like these, the kind that confuse exclusion for elegance. But she hadn't come to impress. She came because her son asked her to, because her presence meant something to him. What they didn't know, what they didn't care to know, was that Evelyn Turner's name carried weight, not in the country clubs of Willow Heights, but in places that actually mattered. Hospitals, scholarships, community centers, endowments. Evelyn never asked for credit. She just changed lives and kept moving. But that day, the Montgomerys didn't see a woman who had built a legacy. They saw an outsider, an inconvenience, and they acted accordingly. Olivia knew her family. She knew what their smiles really meant. She had seen her mother praise people to their faces and tear them down the moment they turned away. Appearances were everything to Victoria Montgomery, and Olivia had spent her entire life trying to meet her mother's unspoken expectations. But as she watched Evelyn Turner walk into that estate and receive nothing but cold politeness, something twisted in her stomach. Michael had told her who his mother was, not in grand speeches or sentimental stories, but in the way he lived, the way he respected people, the way he listened before he spoke. Everything strong and centered in him had come from Evelyn. Still, Olivia hadn't prepared for the way her family would react, or refuse to. The seating chart had been altered without her knowledge. Evelyn's name pushed from a prominent table to one far from the center. Victoria claimed it was a last-minute switch due to numbers. Olivia knew better. Then there was Richard, her father. He called Evelyn regal, but in the same breath made a joke about how money doesn't always translate across generations. It wasn't a compliment, it was a coded insult, one meant to reinforce hierarchy. Evelyn, as always, responded with poise, but Olivia felt the growing heat of shame and rage. She was marrying the man she loved, and the woman who shaped that man, the woman who should have been honored, was being treated like she barely existed. Even worse, the guests followed the Montgomerys' lead. Eyes slid over Evelyn as if she were furniture. Not a single guest, outside of Michael's college friends, bothered to engage her in real conversation. The older guests offered polite nods. The younger ones ignored her entirely. Olivia wanted to speak up, but the voice in her head, her mother's voice, kept whispering, "Don't cause a scene. Keep the energy right. Let's not make it awkward." So she didn't, and that silence would cost her. Unresolved thread. Because every time Olivia chose comfort over courage, she handed her mother more control, and pushed Evelyn one step further from the respect she deserved. But what happened when the truth came out, and how did she deliver brutal payback? What would you have done if you saw your future in-laws treating your parent like this? Stay silent or speak up. Let me know in the comments below. The Montgomery estate looked like something torn from a luxury magazine. White marble floors, gold accents, waitstaff in tailored uniforms moving like clockwork. But underneath the shine was tension. Victoria Montgomery gripped a clipboard like it was a weapon. Candles out of alignment. Replace the orchid centerpiece. And where's the champagne refill? She snapped. No one questioned her. No one dared. She wasn't preparing for a wedding. She was preparing for a performance. Every chair, every menu card, every guest, chosen to reflect the family's image of power. Michael Turner stood just outside the chaos, adjusting his cufflinks, breathing slowly. He wasn't nervous about the vows. He was nervous about his mother. Not because she'd embarrass him. Evelyn Turner never did that. But because he knew what she was about to walk into. He also knew Olivia hadn't pushed back hard enough. Not on the seating. Not on her mother's tone. Not on the silence that stretched every time Evelyn's name came up. Still, he hoped for peace. Then the gates opened. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway. No security needed. No escort. Evelyn Turner had arrived. She stepped out of the car slowly, not because she needed help, but because she moved with purpose. Evelyn Turner wore a navy blue suit, pressed sharp at every seam, with a brooch that gleamed just enough to whisper refinement, not scream for it. The valet nodded at her respectfully. "Welcome, ma'am." He didn't say it out of duty. He said it like someone who knew her. Inside the foyer, the hum of polite conversation stumbled when she entered. The room didn't go quiet, but it shifted. Olivia glanced up and froze. Michael gave a half smile of relief. Victoria, of course, walked straight toward her with a curated smile. "Ah, Michael's mother," she said. No greeting, no name, no gesture of warmth. Evelyn extended her hand. "Evelyn Turner." Victoria shook it briefly, then turned before Evelyn had finished speaking. "Darling," she called to a guest behind her. "Have you seen the cake set up?" Dismissed. Evelyn said nothing. She simply walked further into the room, noting the lowered voices, the averted eyes. She'd been here before. Different faces, same arrogance. One waiter nodded at her with sincere respect as he passed. She returned the gesture. Then came the first clear insult. The place card. Her assigned seat? Near the back, next to the coat check. A table with no view of the couple, no position of honor. Michael noticed it immediately. Olivia looked like she wanted to speak, but didn't. What Olivia didn't understand was that silence wasn't neutral, and the price of that silence was about to grow fast. As guests continued arriving, laughter echoed through the estate, effortless for some, performative for others. The orchestra tuned in the background. Olivia floated from room to room, doing her best impression of calm, pausing every so often to check her lipstick, straighten her dress, and avoid her mother's glare. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat alone. At her corner table she watched the room, not bitter, not hurt, but aware. She wasn't one to seek attention. That was never her style. But the omissions were loud. She was offered coffee, not champagne. Her presence acknowledged, not celebrated. And no one seemed to wonder why a woman so composed, so self-possessed, radiated something far beyond good posture. The only people who noticed, the staff. A young florist passed and whispered, "It's an honor to see you again, Mrs. Turner." A second waiter offered, "Your foundation helped my niece, thank you." No fanfare, just respect, the kind that can't be faked. Flashback brief. Michael, as a child, sitting beside Evelyn in a sunlit room. She's writing checks, not for show but to keep community programs alive. She teaches him, real power isn't loud, baby. It doesn't need to raise its voice. Back at the wedding, Evelyn raised no voice. She didn't need to. But every slight, every sidelong look, every shallow smile was being recorded, not in anger, not for revenge, but for clarity. The Montgomerys had made one brutal mistake. They assumed quiet meant powerless. But what happened when the truth came out, and how did she deliver brutal payback? What would you have done if someone treated your mother like this? Let it slide, or set the room straight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The sun dipped low as the reception began. Under the grand tent stretched across the Montgomery lawn, crystal glasses gleamed under chandeliers, and the string quartet played soft melodies meant to suggest class. The guests, nearly all friends, investors or legacy families, mingled with effortless entitlement. Victoria, of course, was in her element. She floated from table to table, flanked by sycophants, dropping half-laughs and exaggerated compliments. And when she took the stage for the first toast, her posture straightened like she was delivering a political address. "Family," she began, raising her glass, "is more than blood. It's history, it's tradition, and today we add a new chapter to ours." The crowd nodded along, basking in the illusion that they were witnessing something profound. "From the Montgomery estate," she continued, "to the schools and charities we've supported for generations, we've always believed in building a legacy that endures." Olivia smiled tightly. Michael didn't blink. At a far table, Evelyn listened, quietly, her hands folded, her eyes steady. She didn't need to speak. The speech said enough. Victoria wasn't celebrating a marriage. She was asserting a bloodline. Guests clapped. Some stood. One woman turned toward Evelyn and said, "Quite an honor for your son, isn't it? To be welcomed into this." The tone wasn't congratulatory. It was condescending, as if Michael had won a prize he didn't deserve. Evelyn offered a gracious nod. "He's always brought honor to wherever he walks." The woman didn't know how to respond. She turned away, flustered. And then it began, subtle but contagious. The way guests started referring to Evelyn as Michael's mother, instead of using her name. The way waiters, now mimicking the tone set by their employers, stopped offering her champagne without being asked. Conversations around her table were brief, shallow, and always ended with an abrupt smile and a turned shoulder. William Turner stood nearby, hands behind his back, watching it all unfold. His jaw tightened slightly, each time someone made a patronizing remark in Evelyn's direction. But she gave him a glance, barely a second long, and that was enough to say, "Don't." She wasn't angry, not yet, but rage has a strange way of collecting in silence, until the moment it chooses to answer back. The next speech came from Richard Montgomery, standing beside Victoria, with a Scotch glass in hand and a voice marinated in self-importance. He began, "Watching Olivia grow up in this home, surrounded by culture, discipline, and refinement, it makes today all the more meaningful, because today we pass those values on to a new family line." He paused, looked directly toward Michael. "To the Turners, we say welcome, and congratulations." It sounded warm, but beneath the words was a message. "You're lucky to be here." Michael forced a smile. Olivia stared at the floor. Imported truffle risotto.
waiters moving with practiced formality. But Evelyn still sat alone, her seat wedged between two chairs intentionally left empty. No guests had dared request them. Across the room, small conversations grew bolder. "She's very composed, isn't she? Michael's mother must be used to smaller affairs. I hear she was a school teacher or something." Victoria, seated at the head table, laughed just a bit too loud. She was glowing from her own performance. And then, during the father-daughter dance, it happened. She leaned toward a family friend beside her, swirling wine, and said, just loud enough, "It's amazing how far some people have come, isn't it? I mean, who would have thought?" Laughter followed. Not universal, but enough. Guests glanced around, unsure how to react. A few smirked. One or two looked down in discomfort. Michael stopped mid-step. Olivia froze in his arms. The music played on. William clenched the edge of his table. But Evelyn, she didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She simply smiled. Not out of politeness, but because she knew something they didn't. She had heard this kind of condescension before. She'd outlived it, outworked it, outsmarted it. Her smile said one thing clearly. This is your legacy. And somewhere in the distance a photographer raised a camera, capturing the exact moment the room lost its grace. They thought they were writing history, but they had no idea a different narrative was unfolding, one they couldn't control, and it was almost time for it to surface. The dance ended. Applause echoed, but it felt thinner now, less sure of itself. Olivia stepped away from the crowd, her hands trembling just enough to notice. Michael followed, trying not to let frustration boil over, but it was there, in his clenched jaw, his shortened breath, the way he avoided eye contact with Victoria. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly. She hadn't moved from her seat. She hadn't said a word in hours, but the power in her silence had only grown heavier. Some guests began to notice. A man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She hasn't responded once. That's impressive." Another said, "She's either got the patience of a saint, or she's planning something." Evelyn sipped her water, unbothered. William, now standing just a few steps behind her, scanned the room. He saw the smirks, the narrowed eyes, the casual arrogance of people who believed their titles meant something. And he saw something else too, fear in the eyes of those just beginning to realize that Evelyn Turner was not who they thought she was, that maybe they had misjudged her entirely. Victoria, for her part, remained oblivious. She laughed louder. She told a story about her father's real estate empire. She mentioned legacy 3 times in one paragraph, and then she looked directly at Evelyn. Not a long look, just a glance, a smirk, a silent confirmation of everything she thought she had accomplished that night. But she missed one crucial detail. Evelyn had never entered the room to seek validation. She came to support her son. She stayed to observe, and now she was preparing for something far more meaningful than retaliation. She was preparing for a moment of clarity that no amount of money, champagne, or social standing could soften. The room didn't know it, but they were seconds away from the kind of truth that doesn't whisper. It hits. So when the microphone shifted hands, and a new voice took the stage, the entire room held its breath, because brutal payback doesn't always come with rage. Sometimes it wears elegance. Have you ever watched someone keep calm while being disrespected, only to respond in a way no one expected? Tell us about that moment in the comments. We want to hear your turning point stories.
The clinking of glasses faded, the music softened. A pause filled the air, a stillness that made the next voice even more commanding. William Turner stepped onto the stage. No one announced him. He didn't raise his hands or tap a glass. He simply waited until the room took notice, and they did. He cleared his throat, then spoke. "I'll keep this brief. We've heard beautiful words tonight, and I want to thank the Montgomerys for hosting this celebration. It's no small feat to bring so many people together for love." A wave of polite applause followed. Victoria smiled, clearly expecting another compliment. William continued. "When I first met Richard and Victoria, I was told we were 2 families from different worlds, and that may be true, but not in the way you might think." His voice stayed calm, steady, but something had shifted. A low current building. "I'm here as Michael's father, but I'm also here as Evelyn Turner's son." He turned slightly toward his mother, who remained seated, still poised, expression unchanged. "And I need to say something that hasn't been said enough today." Now the room began to tighten. "Some of you may not know much about Evelyn. Maybe you've seen her here tonight and made certain assumptions about her role, her past, her worth." A few guests shifted in their seats. "But let me share what you weren't told. Not because she wanted to be hidden, but because many of you chose not to look." And in the next moments, William wouldn't just speak. He'd expose secrets that would land like stone, truths no one in that room was prepared to carry. William's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Evelyn Turner," he said, "was never interested in attention. That's not her style. While others chased praise, she chased purpose." He paused, just enough to make the room listen. "Years ago she built the Turner Foundation, quietly, privately, and through it she's funded housing for single mothers, after-school programs, and college scholarships for students who would have never had a shot otherwise." Now the whispers began. Some guests sat up straighter, others exchanged looks. Still William continued. "You know the children's hospital just outside the city? The one named after a benefactor nobody ever sees?" A longer pause. "She funded it. Every wing, every bed." Mouths parted, faces froze. One woman gasped. She wasn't alone. "And the church where Olivia and Michael first met?" he added, turning toward the bride. "It was scheduled for demolition after a fire. Evelyn paid to rebuild it, and she did it anonymously." Olivia's eyes welled up. Her father gripped the arms of his chair. Victoria's wineglass tilted slightly in her hand, fingers locked. William surveyed the room, once glowing with superficial grace, now stunned into silence. "You see," he said, "my mother didn't just show up today. She helped build the very foundation this wedding stands on." Someone dropped their fork. A man near the bar muttered under his breath, "I had no idea." Exactly. They didn't know, because they didn't care to ask. And now they were seeing it all too late. This wasn't just a lesson in humility. It was a brutal reminder of what happens when you mistake elegance for emptiness, and pride for power. Silence gripped the room, not the elegant kind they curated, but the kind that stung. Victoria Montgomery, once glowing under chandeliers, now sat stone still, her fingers wrapped around the stem of her wineglass, gripped too tight. She didn't blink, didn't speak, because nothing she could say would change what had just happened. Richard leaned forward like he was going to say something, then thought better of it. Guests who had laughed hours earlier now avoided eye contact. Some stared at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time. Others looked away in shame. One woman whispered, "That's the woman at table 14. She paid for the church?" Another said. And still, Evelyn hadn't moved. She remained in her seat, back straight, expression soft. She hadn't demanded the spotlight. She never even stood. But she owned that room in a way none of them ever could, and they knew it. William finished his toast the same way he began, calm, clear, and unshakable. "To my mother," he said, raising his glass. "To dignity, to real legacy, and to the kind of power that doesn't need to prove itself." Some guests stood to clap, others followed. It wasn't roaring applause, it was reverence, the kind that only truth can pull out of people. Olivia crossed the room, tears silently slipping down her cheeks. She knelt beside Evelyn, took her hand and whispered, "I'm sorry, I should have said something, I should have done more." Evelyn looked at her. "You're saying it now," she said. "That matters." Michael came next. He didn't speak, he just kissed his mother's hand. Victoria didn't move. She had spent the entire night choreographing perfection. But the moment people would remember, the one they'd tell again and again, wasn't hers, it was Evelyn's. They tried to treat her like an afterthought. But now, they'd never forget her, because when the truth came out, she didn't demand revenge, she became it. What would you have done if you were in Evelyn's place? Would you have spoken up, or let the truth speak for you? Drop your answer in the comments. The room had changed. It wasn't just the lighting or the music. It was the energy, how people moved, how they looked at Evelyn Turner now. No longer an accessory to the groom, no longer a stranger at the wrong table. She had become the center of the room without ever raising her voice. Guests who had barely acknowledged her before now approached one by one, offering hands, soft-spoken admiration, and late apologies disguised as compliments. "Mrs. Turner, I had no idea. Your work is truly. I'm ashamed to say I never connected your name to the foundation. My niece received care at that hospital. Evelyn responded to each one the same way, politely, without indulgence. She didn't gloat, she didn't correct, she accepted their words as calmly as she'd accepted their silence. Victoria watched it all unfold from the head table. For the first time that evening, she was no longer in control, and that terrified her. She stood, forced a smile, and crossed the floor to Evelyn. The eyes of the room followed her, some in anticipation, others in judgment. Victoria extended a hand. "Mrs. Turner," she said, voice light, "I hope you know how grateful we are to have you here, and how impressed I am by all you've done, truly." It sounded like humility, but Evelyn could hear the panic behind it. She looked at Victoria's hand, then shook it. "I've always believed respect is earned through action," she said gently, "not appearance." Victoria's mouth tightened. "And what you've built," Evelyn continued, "is impressive in its own way. But the people you build around you, they say even more." Victoria had no reply, because that wasn't just a response, it was brutal clarity, delivered with grace, and while Victoria tried to salvage the image, the truth had already been set free. But what happened when the spotlight faded, when the guests left, and the shame set in? The night carried on, but the rhythm had shifted. Conversations softened, laughter faded. No one returned to their earlier arrogance. Evelyn had said very little, but what lingered now was everything she'd made them feel. Olivia found her moment when the crowd thinned near the garden doors. She stepped outside into the cool air, pulled her dress away from her legs, and sat heavily on a stone bench. Her hands trembled. She didn't see Evelyn approach, just felt her presence beside her, calm and rooted, as if she'd been there the whole time. "I'm sorry," Olivia whispered. "I let it happen. I watched it happen." Evelyn said nothing. She waited. "I thought I was keeping the peace. I told myself it wasn't my place. But the truth is," Olivia's voice cracked, "I was afraid of what my mother would say. And I failed you." There was a long pause. Then Evelyn spoke. "You didn't fail me." Olivia looked up, eyes wet. "You failed yourself." The words weren't cruel. They were clean, precise, and true. Evelyn continued, "People like your mother build walls because they're afraid of what they don't understand. You were raised in that house. That fear doesn't make you weak, but holding on to it does." Tears rolled freely now. Olivia didn't care who saw. "I want to be better," she said. "I want to be different from them." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then be different. Don't apologize for it. Live it." They sat in silence after that. Not awkward silence, not shameful. The kind of silence that resets everything. Inside, Michael watched them from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He knew what was happening wasn't for him. It was for them. And Olivia. She wasn't just crying for Evelyn. She was finally mourning the version of herself she'd outgrown. But what would become of the Montgomerys, the house built on legacy, now shaken by truth? And how would Evelyn leave them with rage, or something far more unforgettable? The final hour of the night felt like a different event entirely. Evelyn no longer sat on the margins. She didn't need to move from her seat. Others moved to her. Guests leaned in when she spoke. Her quiet presence now commanded respect the Montgomerys could only pretend to understand. One by one, people offered kind words, real ones. A young nurse approached to thank her for funding her scholarship. A father spoke about his son recovering in the very hospital Evelyn had saved. And all Victoria could do was watch. The legacy she had tried to project all night now looked small beside the one Evelyn had built in silence. Her words were powerless, her posture stiff, her smile drained. For once she had nothing to offer. Michael walked over to his mother, knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "I hope I make you proud," he said. Evelyn looked at him with that familiar steadiness, the one that raised him, guided him, protected him. "You always have." That was it. Not a dramatic speech, no long explanation, just truth, delivered without apology. As the guests began to leave, they passed Evelyn with soft nods and lowered eyes, not out of guilt but respect. And as the music slowed and the lights dimmed, the story of the evening had already rewritten itself. Not the wedding, not the name Montgomery, but the name Turner. She didn't destroy anyone. She didn't seek revenge. She simply reminded them who she was, and let the truth do the rest. And in the end, that was the most brutal payback of all. What's more powerful, fighting back with anger,
or answering disrespect with dignity. If you were Evelyn, how would you have handled that room? Drop your answer below. Photos were posted, toasts were quoted, but the moment people remembered wasn't the bouquet toss or the string quartet, it was Evelyn Turner. Olivia sat alone on her honeymoon balcony, journal in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about what her mother would say, she was thinking about what she wanted to stand for. She began writing, not an apology, not a confession, a promise, to speak up, to see clearly, to never again let silence be her shield. Her wedding had been the performance her parents wanted, but her marriage, that was hers, and it would be built differently, with Michael, with truth, with respect earned, not inherited. But while Olivia grew into her future, her parents were left sitting in the aftermath of their past, and Evelyn, she had already moved on. Back in Willow Heights, the Montgomery estate stood as polished as ever, but inside, something had shifted. Victoria wandered through her drawing room in silence. The walls were still lined with portraits. Her favorite vase still sat on its pedestal. The curtains still fell perfectly to the floor, but for the first time she wasn't comforted by any of it. She had hosted hundreds of guests over the years, raised glasses, led fundraisers, spoken about legacy more times than she could count, but now, no one was talking about the chandeliers, or the menu. They were talking about Evelyn Turner, and the worst part wasn't that Victoria had underestimated her, it was that she'd done it so casually. Richard hadn't spoken much since that night either. He spent most mornings reading the paper without reading a word of it. His scotch sat untouched on the side table. A man once puffed with confidence now shrinking beneath the weight of his own quiet embarrassment. They hadn't just been outclassed, they'd been exposed by a woman who never raised her voice, never asked for the room, never demanded a spotlight. All Evelyn had done was exist in her truth, and that had been enough to shake the entire illusion they'd built around themselves. They could host another event, print a glossy press release, find some way to polish the story for their circle, but they knew, everyone else knew too, and nothing tarnishes pride like knowing you were wrong, loudly in front of people who won't forget it. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her kitchen 2 towns over, same simple tea, same garden out back, same woman. A letter sat beside her, handwritten, sealed in a cream envelope, from Olivia. It didn't need to be long, it only needed to be real, and Evelyn smiled, not because she needed an apology, but because the future looked different now, stronger, clearer, worth it. But what came next wasn't just growth, it was something deeper, something lasting, because while the Montgomerys were still living off name and noise, Evelyn Turner's legacy was just getting started. A year passed. Not much had changed in Willow Heights on the surface. The lawns were still trimmed with manicured precision. The parties still glimmered with tailored suits and half-true compliments. But the story of that wedding, the one that was meant to define the Montgomery name, had taken on a life of its own. Not because of the venue, not because of the decor, because of Evelyn Turner. No longer as a quiet guest at the edge of a photo, but as the woman who had owned the room without raising her voice. Her name came up at City Hall meetings, on donor boards, in classrooms and hospital corridors. Her silence that night had spoken louder than any insult they threw her way. But Evelyn didn't seek recognition. She never had. She stayed focused. Focused on her work, her family, her purpose, on the things that actually mattered. One afternoon, she received an invitation in the mail, not engraved, not flashy. It was from the community health initiative she had helped fund years ago. The city had decided to name the entire building after her. She hesitated at first, but Michael encouraged her to go. Olivia insisted on coming too. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor stood behind the podium and spoke of legacy, not the kind etched in stone, but the kind felt in every life touched by quiet sacrifice. When Evelyn stepped forward, applause rolled through the crowd, not forced, not polite, it was earned. She stood beneath the new sign bearing her name, eyes soft, posture strong. Olivia leaned toward her and whispered, "You don't need a statue." "I don't want one," Evelyn replied, "but I want them to know." And they did, not just because of that sign, but because of the way she had carried herself. In a room full of people who tried to shrink her, she had stood still, and in doing so forced everyone else to see her for what she truly was. Later that evening, as Evelyn sat beside her son and daughter-in-law, watching children play near the building's entrance, she smiled, not because she had won, but because she had never needed to fight in the first place. She had always known who she was, Brutal payback doesn't always come with rage. Sometimes it comes in the form of grace, of patience, of a life so full of value, it exposes everything false around it. They tried to erase her. Instead, they remembered her. What kind of legacy would you want to leave behind? Would you fight to be heard, or would you wait until the silence had no choice but to listen? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Respect isn't about wealth or status, it's about how you carry yourself, even when no one is watching. Respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you show. The Montgomerys had wealth, they had prestige, they had a name that opened doors, but what they lacked was humility. Evelyn Turner didn't ask for recognition. She walked into that room with grace, not expectation. She left without raising her voice, but no one would ever forget what she revealed, because real legacy isn't loud, it's lived. It's easy to be fooled by appearances, to assume that the loudest person in the room is the leader, that the most expensive suit belongs to the most important soul. But sometimes power wears quiet, sometimes grace doesn't arrive in gold, but in the calm of someone who doesn't need to prove anything at all. The Montgomerys tried to silence Evelyn through subtle slights and smiling disregard. Instead they exposed themselves, and Evelyn, she never had to lift a finger. The woman they tried to ignore was the one who made it all possible, and they'll never forget it. Because when the truth finally came out, it didn't arrive with rage, it arrived dressed in grace, and that was the most brutal payback of all. So what really happens when you try to bury someone who's already built the foundation you stand on? And how did Evelyn deliver her revenge without ever raising her voice? Which matters more to you, status or substance? Comment below and share this story with someone who needs the reminder. Quiet strength leaves the loudest echo.